I remember I was in maybe 6th grade. We lived in Cleveland, Tennessee. And I was having trouble in class. And not the normal, he's not turning in his homework or he's not paying attention in class. I was having trouble seeing in class. I remember sitting back near the back, and particularly it was geometry class. And I remember sitting back in the back and trying to read the board, trying to see what was up there, but I couldn't. And so my mother decided, well, it's time that Alan goes and gets a glasses appointment. He needs to go see the eye doctor. And so we went there, and after a series of tests, the little slide things come in front of your eyes, which one's clear, which one's clear, I got my first pair of glasses. And I will never, ever forget, no matter how old I get, no matter where I go, I will never forget that reaction. My first time I ever walked outside wearing a pair of glasses. It was unreal. Before I ever got my first pair of glasses, all I knew were shapes and blobs. And that's how I identified people. Even in school, when someone would come up to me, I'd either recognize them by their voice, I'd recognize them by their shape or the way they walked or what they did. And it was a very, very interesting way that I lived because I never was used to seeing people for what they were because my vision was always blurred. So I walked outside for the very first time with my new pair of glasses. And from, it seemed to me like 100 yards away, I could see individual leaves on trees. The only thing I knew about trees was that they're outside, they're green, they're blobs, and they make me sneeze. But I could see every individual leaf on the tree. It completely changed my perspective. And ever since then, since my 6th grade year, I've been wearing glasses or contacts. So if you see me outside and I'm not wearing my glasses, don't be alarmed because I'm driving. I'm probably wearing my contacts. But you get the idea. Before I had my glasses, my vision was blurred. I didn't really know what the real world looked like. And so my vision was kind of skewed, and my perception, because of that, was kind of skewed as well. And of course, I know as I go along through life, my vision's going to blur. It's going to get worse, which is already pretty bad enough. But it seems to me like in our spiritual lives, the reverse is exactly the same. When we're first baptized into Christ, when we first give our lives over to Christ, we put on what I like to call Christ-colored glasses. For the first time in our lives, once we come out of that water, once we learn more about Jesus and His view for people and God's will for people, we start seeing the world differently. People start to become clearer. Objects in our lives that we never really understood before we were in Christ become clearer. And reverse as it is in real life, whereas my vision will get worse as it goes along, as we become Christians and as we mature in the faith, our vision will only get sharper. We learn more, we study more, we apply that more, and our Christ-colored glasses are more available to us. What I'd like to do this afternoon with our allotted time, I would like to go through the Gospels, and I want to put on our Christ-colored glasses. We always talk about wearing our first century glasses and put that in perspective. But what about our Christ-colored glasses? What I want to do is look at how Christ looked at people in His life. And in comparison, look at how we look at people in our lives and cross-examine the two of them. So if you would, go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8. My first point this afternoon is that Jesus looked past the physical. Jesus looked past the physical. Now what do I mean when I say physical? Am I talking about how you look, how you dress, what kind of car you drive, all that stuff? Jesus looked past the physical. Consider for a moment, before we dive into our text, consider for a moment His apostles that He picked. Now realize this is the Son of God coming to earth to fulfill God's will for mankind. And so we're thinking from a very secular point of view, He's going to pick the politicians of the world. He's going to pick the rich. He's going to pick those who can have great influence over people in very secular ways, in very physical ways. Does He pick the politicians for His work? Does He pick the greatest among Israel? No. There are some occupations we know that the apostles were. Peter, Andrew, James, and John were not politics. They weren't politicians. They weren't anything great. They were fishermen. Fishermen. Run-of-the-mill, average labor work. Very similar today, we would consider to work in a carpet mill. Right? It's very labor-based. That's what they were. Who else did He pick? Well, Matthew was a tax collector. Now, I'm thinking in my mind, if I'm the Son of God, I'm not trying to be pretentious or anything, just trying to put myself in that situation. I'm trying to pick people who is going to help me, who are going to help me through my journey, trying to fulfill God's will. I'm not going to pick someone who is generally hated among the public. Matthew was a tax collector, which means that he was directly associated with Rome. Rome at that time was not looked upon very fairly by the Jews. And so as he's going through his ministry, Matthew's with Jesus, and everyone knows that this man is heavily associated with Rome. On that note, who else did he pick? Well, he picked Simon, who was a zealot. Now, a zealot was essentially, not trying to be disrespectful, but it was a religious fanatic. Particularly, it was a religious fanatic who believed that the Messiah was going to come back and he was going to lead Israel in this physical assault against Rome, their captor. That's exactly what he thought. Do you think maybe Matthew and Simon ever butted heads? Matthew being a tax collector from Rome, Simon being the person who was against Rome? These people are who Jesus picked. The lower. No one really special. But Jesus picked them because of their hearts. Jesus picked them because of what they could do. And Jesus picked them to be examples. But Jesus looked past the physical in that he picked normal people to carry out his divine mission. Second of all, we realize that he looked past even appearance. We have to realize that, first of all, Jesus himself was homeless. Look back at Matthew 8. Matthew 8, verse 20. Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." When Jesus began his ministry, there's a reason that we don't see him living in one solidified area. It's because Jesus went around. Jesus lived wherever he could. Jesus found houses to live in. He himself, as we would classify today, he was homeless. He was homeless. His predecessor, John the Baptist, we read in Matthew chapter 3 and verse 1, "In those days John the Baptist came preaching in the wilderness of Judea. Now John wore a garment of camel's hair and a leather belt around his waist, and his food was locusts and wild honey." His predecessor, John the Baptist, who claimed that Jesus was the Messiah, getting people ready for Jesus, he was also homeless. He had no home. He lived in the wilderness. He killed animals for his clothes. He ate wild things for his food. He had nowhere as well to lay his head. How do we look upon that in our lives today? If Jesus was the same person that he was then, meaning in a very physical sense, if a homeless man came in here today, he's ratty, maybe he just goes around finding things to eat, he goes wherever he can sleep, and he has this message that's completely different from what we've heard all of our lives, would we believe Jesus? How much of our Christ-colored glasses do we have on all the time? But not only was Jesus homeless, not only was his predecessor John the Baptist homeless, even his disciples agreed to live this kind of life. Look at Matthew 12:1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. Why were his disciples eating grain on the way they were traveling? Well, because they had no solid home to go back and eat. You and I can go back home. If I wanted to say right now, Mom, we're going to go have 50-something guests at home, we could go to our home where we pay our stuff for it, and we could go and eat there and live there. The disciples didn't have that. Jesus did not have that. And his predecessor, John the Baptist, did not have that. Jesus, the way he viewed people was past the physical. The way that Jesus viewed people through his, if you will, Christ-colored glasses was completely overlooking the physical. But also we realize, point number 2, that Jesus looked past the problems. Jesus looked past the problems. And when we put our Christ-colored glasses on, we should also be able to look past the problems. Now, what do I mean when I say that Jesus looked past the problems? What are some problems in our society today, things that we consider very much taboo? Well, the first thing I think of, and maybe it's the same with you, it's almost been just run down now as far as how much everyone talks about it, but it's homosexuality. It's a problem in our society. And of course, we as Bible-believing Christians point to the Bible, and we say that homosexuality is wrong. I can show you where it's wrong. I can show you where Paul condemned it, show you where the Old Testament is condemned, and show you back in Genesis 1 where God arranged marriage. Sure, we can do that. We can do that. But that's a problem for us, isn't it? It's a problem in our society. What else? You still got adultery running around rampant. And in the church specifically, marriage, divorce, remarriage, these are problems. But Jesus, when he put on his Christ-colored glasses, the way he see people, the way he saw, I said seed. Wow. We'll try it again. The the way he saw people was past these problems that they brought with them. Turn to John chapter 4 very quickly. John chapter 4. Now before we read this passage, it's interesting to note the history that Samaria and Israel have with each other. And if you're not familiar, I'm going to do a little rundown very quickly. At the end of, or after Solomon's reign, Israel split into two camps, pretty much. The northern half was the 10 tribes, and they were later called Samaria. And the bottom half was called Judah. And so the northern half was taken captive by Assyria, and so they were taken away. And then later on, the southern half, Judah, was taken captive by Babylon. And while they're all out of Israel, they send some people back. Both Assyria and Babylon bring some people back to Judah. Now, for Assyria, they bring people back, and the Jews come back with their wives. They come back with their customs. They come back with evil things that Assyria was doing. And so in that, Samaria was cursed, because the Israelites who were taken there brought back things that God didn't want. But likewise, some Israelites from Babylon were brought back just to rebuild the temple. A king named Cyrus decreed that the Jews could go back just to rebuild the temple, just to practice their own religion. And so this is where the real controversy between Samaria and Judah comes into play, or Samaria and Israel. So they're brought back, the Jews from captivity in Babylon, they're brought back to rebuild the temple. But what happens between the two? Turn to Ezra chapter 4, if you will, for a moment, keeping your finger on John 4. Ezra 4. Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the father's house and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." When the Assyrian captives came back, they thought they were practicing the right doctrine. They thought they were doing everything that God wanted them to do. And so what they're doing here, as when the Babylonian captives came back, they're offering to help rebuild the temple. But read verse 3 of Ezra chapter 4. But Zerubbabel, Eshua, and the rest of the heads of the fathers' houses in Israel said to them, "You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." And so they offer to help. The Assyrian captives offer to help. They're rejected. So what do they do in verses 4 and 5? Let's read that in Ezra 4. "Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build, and bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purpose, all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia." So now we've got this first conflict, right? The Jews are being brought back in the south to rebuild the temple. The Assyrian captives come to them and say, "We want to help you do this. We worship God as you have. And we want to worship God as you have." But the people in Judah say, "No, we don't want anything to do with you." So I guess in spite of them, the people in the north decide to delay their building. That's one tension that we have already. But later on we find out that the Samaritans go ahead and build a temple in the north. They build a temple in the north wanting to worship God in the ways that they know how. And so they built that temple in the north, and what did the Jews do? Well, eventually the Jews come and destroy that temple that's in the north. And so look at this conflict you've got between what we consider the Jews and the Samaritans. And later on, the regions kind of blended, and Samaria became this little dot. And here's all of Israel, and Samaria kind of landed right in here. So no Jew would ever go through Samaria. You would always go around Samaria to get to the top of Israel. This is what Jesus is walking into right now. All of that history with the Samaritans. All of that tension that they still have with the Samaritans and between the Jews. Jesus is walking into this environment. He's going to stroll through and look past the problems to make a point. So the first thing we realize is that he looked past history. Jesus looked past history. Obviously, we just talked about the Jewish and the Samaritan history that they shared together. But also, Jesus looked past the woman's history. Look very quickly at John 4, 19 through 24. Scratch that, I'm sorry. Start in verse 16. Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You were right in saying, 'I have no husband.' For you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." Was there already a red flag for Jesus being a Jew? Well, yeah, you don't go through Samaria. Was there a red flag with the woman being a woman? Yeah, you don't go around, especially Samaritan women. Now, was there a red flag for Jesus here as he talked about the woman's history? She's a Samaritan, she's a woman, and she's been living an unfaithful life. To any other Jew in the world, at this time, they would have walked away. If they'd even been brave enough to go forward as it was, at this point they would have walked away. But Jesus decides to overlook her history. Looking past the problems, he looks past her history in order to do what he was sent here to do. Second of all, we know that he looked past religion. Jesus looked past religion. This is one that in our society today we have a harder time in dealing with. We think you're not the same religion, we can't really deal with you. There's nothing we can do with you unless you have faith in God. We look at the denominations and we think, well, there's some promise in the denominations because they still have a belief in God. They have a belief similar to ours, but as far as other religions way out there, we don't even want to give it thought. But Jesus looks past this woman's Samaritan religion to try and reach her to do what God wants him to do. Now let's look in 4:19 through 24. The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that Jerusalem is the place where we ought to worship." Time out. Time out. The woman's making an assumption. Remember back to our little history thing we just had? They built a temple on that mountain. Right there is where they claimed that they could worship and worship God properly. And so she's recounting their history, I guess in case Jesus didn't know or he was ignorant, because after all he's talking to a Samaritan woman, so is he crazy to begin with anyway? But then she talks about, you say that Jerusalem is the only place we can worship. This is what you Jews say. So she's making an assumption about Jesus. First of all, she's assuming that maybe he doesn't know as much as he ought to know. But second, she's assuming that he believes the same thing that the other Jews believed and were faulted for. Read verse 21. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit. Those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth." Normally someone facing this different religion would have backed up. You say that Jerusalem is the only place we can worship. We've been worshiping here for however long, and you Jews came and destroyed it. At that point, most of us would probably back up and say, I can't deal with this. This is too controversial. This is too edgy for me. This is too heated for me. I can't take this. Jesus takes it in stride. Jesus takes her complaint. He takes what she sees as the truth, and then he gives her what really is the truth. And the question we ask ourselves is, looking through our Christ-colored glasses, looking through the glasses that Jesus looked through, do we see people like that? Do we see people who aren't necessarily arrogant, who aren't necessarily just angry at other religions, but maybe they're just confused? Maybe that's all they've ever known. If we look at the world through Christ-colored glasses, we can see that sometimes arrogance is not being met with arrogance, or arrogance is not being met with running away. Maybe arrogance needs to be met with mercy, patience, or kindness. He looked past the history, he looked past the religion, but also we realize that he looked past the race. He looked past the race. It's very well documented that the Jews thought that the Samaritans were unclean. They were half-breeds. They went up there in Assyria and did Lord knows what, and then came back and polluted Israel with their filth. That's exactly what the Jews thought. But Jesus considered the Samaritans a part of God's plan. Continue reading in John 4, read verse 34 and following. Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me to accomplish his work. Do you not say there are yet 4 months and comes the harvest? Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. Already the one who reaps is receiving wages and gathering fruit for eternal life, so that the sower and reaper may rejoice together. For here the sayings hold true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap for that which you did not labor. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor." So after the Samaritan woman leaves and says, "I think you're a prophet," she goes to tell her friends, her Samaritan friends, about this prophet who met her at the well. And then the disciples come up and meet him, saying, "Jesus, what are you doing? What are we doing here? And then ask him if he's hungry. And that's where he interjects this. My food is doing the will of him who sent me. The Jews cringed at the idea of dealing with Samaritans because their Christ-colored glasses were not very sharp. And their eyes weren't very adjusted to what God wanted them to see. But Jesus, looking at the Samaritans, saw opportunity. Jesus, looking at the Samaritans, the dirty, heathen, crazy Samaritans, he saw them as opportunity and a part of God's will. Jesus looked past the physical and he looked past the problems. So how did he look at people? If we're looking at our lives today, if we want to look at the world like Christ looked at the world, how exactly should that be? We can't look at the physical because Jesus overlooked the physical. We can't look at the problems, the things that separate us, like race or sexuality or religion, because Jesus overlooked those things to reach people. How do we need to reach people and look at people today if we're going to put on our Christ-colored glasses? As we read the gospel, it's true everywhere that Jesus looked at people in their hearts. Jesus looked at people right in their hearts. I'll turn to Luke 19 very quickly. Luke 19. From this chapter, we realize that Jesus revealed himself to the searching. And Luke 19 is the story of Zacchaeus. And I'm sure if I brought out any of the young girls and asked, what's the story of Zacchaeus, they would tell me, wee little man was he, sycamore tree, blah, 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 blah. Right. Looking for Jesus. Luke 19:3. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was small in stature. Let's go ahead and keep reading. Luke 19:2. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. Verse 7. And when they saw it, they all grumbled. He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. Very much like Matthew, Zacchaeus is a tax collector. As we brought up before, Matthew was not the best looked guy looked upon in the community because he was directly affiliated with Rome. People who take our money for no good reason generally are not viewed to be very good, likable people. And Zacchaeus is one of these people. And in fact, it says he was a chief tax collector, which means probably he would have been well known in that community. And indeed, in verse 7, they said they all grumbled when they saw that he was going to Zacchaeus' house. He's going to be in the presence of a sinner. Does he know who that guy is? Look at him. Look at his job. Look at the way that guy's dressed. He's not like us. He's not like Jesus. Jesus is homeless. He's not a disciple. He's not like Jesus. But what did Jesus look at? Jesus overlooked the physical. Jesus overlooked the problems that the community had with Zacchaeus. How did he look at Zacchaeus? He looked at Zacchaeus' heart. In verse 3, we read that he was seeking to see who Jesus was. Zacchaeus was searching. And for those people, Jesus was going to make himself readily available. Even so much that he climbed up in a tree to try and see over the multitudes to find Jesus. And what was the result? Verse 8, and Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, and he is also a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. To the Jew, no one would have given Zacchaeus a chance. He's short. He takes our money. He's rich. He's got a better house than I do. I don't want to be friends with this guy. I don't even be associated with this guy. We can be that way too. Sometimes our Christ-colored glasses are not as sharp as we'd like them to be. Or sometimes, even as Christians, we just take our Christ-colored glasses off totally. That's how the Jews viewed Zacchaeus. But Jesus saw through the faults. Jesus saw through the physical. And Jesus saw through the problems. Also, we know that Jesus worked with the open-minded. Turn to John chapter 3. John chapter 3. This is a story of Nicodemus. In verse 2, this man came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. This is the verse that Jody brought up this morning. First of all, we need to recognize about Nicodemus that he was open. He was open. Very much unlike all of his Pharisee friends, Nicodemus gave Christ a chance. But look how he came to this conclusion that Jesus was the Christ. Again in verse 2, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. Jesus was searching for people just like this. And he made himself available to Nicodemus very easily. And in fact, in verses 4 through 21, we see that Jesus goes into this long discussion about God's plan. And it's not vague, it's not in a parable, it's not in imagery. He tells them exactly what God has called Christ to do, what he has sent him here to do. And Nicodemus got that chance to hear that. And in other places in the gospel account, we don't read where Jesus was this clear to people. We don't read where Jesus was this open with people about coming to terms with what God wanted him to do. But Jesus revealed that to Nicodemus. Nicodemus was searching for the truth in his heart, and he found it. The Jews, those lower on the pole of society, if you will, saw the Pharisees in some lights as teachers and scribes, but also as people who were above them. People who bound laws. People who were closed-minded. Jesus multiple times called them whitewashed tombs. He said, you're whitewashed tombs, and outside you look really great, but inside you're full of dead men's bones. But Nicodemus was different. Jesus looked past his Pharisee status. He looked past all the things that he had in his life. He looked past appearances, looked past the problems. Looking through his Christ-colored glasses, he saw Nicodemus' heart, and it was open to talk about things. Also, it wasn't all just butterflies and rainbows, though. When Jesus looked at people's heart, it wasn't all just good and decent and holy and open and willing to learn. Sometimes when Jesus looked at people's hearts, he saw corruption and he saw arrogance. And we know that he rebuked the rebellious because of that. Turn to Matthew chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23. While Nicodemus was a good Pharisee, there weren't many good Pharisees that we read of in the Bible. Matthew 23 and verse 2, the scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, so do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do, for they preach, but do not practice. When Christ looked into the hearts of these people, he saw corruption. He saw people who wanted power. He saw people who wanted authority, but didn't have to work for it. He saw people who knew exactly what to do, knew the truth to a T. Everything in the law they were told and they studied. And he saw people who knew all these things, but deliberately changed the laws for their own benefit. Matthew 23 and 4, and they tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. When Christ glared into the hearts of these Pharisees, it wasn't like Zacchaeus, who was searching. It wasn't like the woman at the well, who was open-minded. It wasn't like Nicodemus, who was also open-minded. He saw people who knew what to do. He saw people who had every responsibility to do the right thing and to teach other people the right thing, yet they did not do it. The Pharisees knew the truth, but they failed to practice it. And that's why Jesus calls them out so much. There were people in the first century, in Jewish times, who were essentially dying from false doctrine, if you will. The Pharisees were telling them these things that weren't the right thing to do, and they were suffering for it. And so the responsibility really fell on the Pharisees at that point. They had so much influence over the world, they had so much social status, and they used it for their own benefit. They used it not for God's glory. When Jesus stared into the hearts of the ignorant, he was patient. Turn to Luke 23. Luke 23. As you're turning there, I want you to think about the darkest moment of your life. I want you to think about the loss of a child. I want you to think about the loss of a spouse. Think of the most horrendous thing in your life. Now imagine the person who might be responsible for making that thing possible. Imagine the cause of that evil thing in your life that caused you so much pain and grief. Through our secular viewpoint, when we're not wearing our Christ-colored glasses, how do we view those people? Hate, anger, fury. If anything, we want those people to suffer the same fate as we did, that they caused us to suffer. But when Christ glared into the hearts of the ignorant, when he glared into the hearts of his enemies, he was patient. And he was long-suffering. Luke 23, starting in verse 33. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right, one on his left. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they cast lots to divide his garments, and the people stood by watching. But the ruler scoffed at him, saying, He saved others. Let him save himself. If he is the Christ, Son of God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself. This was Jesus' darkest hour. And our suffering, in comparison to what Christ suffered, is nothing. Yet look what Jesus does to the ignorant. Look what Jesus does to his adversaries. Does he call 10,000 angels to save himself and to destroy those people who were doing this to him? No. Does he come off the cross and say, look, I proved it to you. You wanted this. I showed you many times before, but here's what I'm doing. My final trick, this is what I'm doing for you. I'm the Son of God. No, he didn't do that. I'm not a Greek scholar like Jody is, and we heard that this morning. But I do know in verse 34, when it says, and Jesus said, Father, forgive them, the verb there is not a past tense. It is not a one time he said. The construction of the Greek there is that he was continually saying. The action wasn't perfect. And Jesus was saying, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Through Christ-colored glasses, we can't afford to seek vengeance. Through Christ-colored glasses, we can't afford to want that same fate for those who cause us that pain. Through Christ-colored glasses, we have to tolerate. But we have to bear with those burdens. We have to lean on one another. That's how Christ looked at people. As he was being crucified, he didn't see maliciousness. He didn't see what the people, what he would do to them, or wasn't trying to seek vengeance. He saw the value. And Christ saw potential in people. Because the people who were essentially crucifying him at that point were the ones that he was going to die for. If we want to impact the world today, we need to put on our Christ-colored glasses. And if we have a weak prescription, we need to increase that prescription. The only way to do that is to learn more. Read the Gospels. Read about Christ. Every verse from this lesson has been from the Gospels. How did Christ look at people? Did he look at the physical? Did he judge them by their appearance? Did he judge them by their social status, their religion? No. Jesus looked at them by their hearts. As Jesus looks at us, what does he see? Does he see someone like Zacchaeus? Are we searching? Are we diligently trying to seek him? Does he see Nicodemus, who is open, willing to change his ideas, willing to change his life to follow Christ? Do they see the disciples, those who are willing to drop everything, drop the physical, and follow him? Does he see the woman at the well, someone who is ignorant, living in sin, who always knew something his or her entire life, but it's not the right thing? Or did Jesus see Pharisees? Does Jesus see people who know the truth and are purposely not doing it? I would dare say we have all kinds of people in here today. I would say most of us are Christians. So I'll address you first. If you're a Christian and you think Jesus looks at you as a Pharisee, as someone who knows the truth, but is willingly denying it, willingly neglecting that truth, change your heart. Change your heart and then put on Christ-colored glasses and look at other people the exact same way. If you're a Christian that's still searching, still seeking, you feel like you need more knowledge, you feel like you need more passion for the gospel, that's how Christ sees you. React to that emotion. React to that instinct that you have. But if you're not a Christian, Jesus sees you as ignorant. Jesus sees you as someone who he died for. Maybe worst of all, Jesus sees you as someone sitting at the foot of his cross, laughing, mocking. If you have a need today to repent from your sins, if you have a need today to come to Christ, get access to His grace, we can help you do that. It's not us that's going to do it, but we can help you gain access to that grace through Him. If you're not a Christian, I would encourage you to study with us. I would encourage you to give it a lot of thought. But if you are a Christian and need to change your life, I would encourage you to get that done however you can. Whether it's here, whether it's back home, whether it's in your personal life, make that change. Because whether I can see it or not, whether your friends and family can see it or not, Jesus is looking right through us, looking at our hearts. Whatever your need is this afternoon, I pray that you make it known. As together we stand and sing.